to get through. We'll get going. Welcome to this session on the Microsoft FHIR server. My name is Michael Hansen, and I work on the team that makes our FHIR APIs. And I'll talk a little bit about the different things that we make here. There's actually two different presentations on this. There's this one here, and then Brendan on Friday will really dive into how you can modify the code and change the server and sort of dive into the code base and stuff. In this presentation, we'll focus mainly on building stuff in the cloud once you have the FHIR server set up and how you get it set up and so on. And then Brendan, in what we refer to as the other talk, will dive into the code. It will be great. You should really go and see that on Friday. So before I get started, though, here's a URL, if it's on the screen there behind me, and also on the screens for the slides and everything that I'll be going through here, details of the tutorial that I'll be walking through. And I'm actually just going to flip over to a browser here and show you this, because what it points to is it will take you to a GitHub repository where, amongst other things, you can find the slides for everything that I'll be going through here. And I'll be doing sort of a tutorial where I'll do things live, hopefully, if the internet cooperates and so on. But I have captured everything in those slides, screenshots of everything, so if you miss any steps as I'm walking through it here, don't worry about it. You can go home and do it at home on your own time, or come and hack with us at our little table that we have outside, or find me somewhere and I'll help you walk through it. So if you miss anything, all the details are in there. So, but let's dive in. As I said, I'm here to talk about our FHIR server, and we really have, what I want to spend a little bit of time on at first is just talk about the different things that we make and how they're related. So we really have two things that you can use. There is what we call the Microsoft FHIR server for Azure, which is an open source project that's available on GitHub. And then we have what we call a managed service. So that's us running a FHIR server for you. And I'll just talk a little bit about what those things mean. So if you go to GitHub/Microsoft/FHIR server, that's where you'll find the open source code for our FHIR server. And this is a very active project, tons of pull requests and code going through there. And this is where our team is actually doing the development for this service. We have templates and things like that in there that allow you to deploy this very quickly into Azure. And it supports Stu3, R4, a couple of different persistence providers on the back end. You can use Cosmos DB or SQL Server. And you can choose those things when you set it up. This is an open source project, as I said, so that means if you take this code and deploy it, you now own this, so to speak. You take responsibility for this, you need to patch it and so on. This responsibility now falls on you. But you also have the ability to tinker with everything, change the code, and that's what you can come and learn about on Friday, how you do that. But with opportunity, as they say, comes great responsibility. So you can shoot yourself in the foot when you start hacking with the server. So what we also have is a managed version of the service where we take, on our team, we take this code, we wrap it up a little bit, and then we run it at scale for you. And you can simply go into the Azure portal and say, hey, give me one of these FHIR servers, and then we will run it for you. You have less opportunity to tinker with things in there, but also if it breaks, it is our problem instead, and we carry pagers and we will fix it. That's a product that's available in general availability, so it comes with an SLA and so on. So for different projects, you may have use for one or the other of these, and it may be that in the beginning of a project you tinker with it here, but later in a project you may want to run the managed service. And I'll show you in a second how to provision this. And just not to linger too long on this, but just think about, if we think about this in different ways of doing cloud computing, there's many different ways that you could do cloud, right? You could buy a bunch of racks, build your own data centers, and run that yourself, and that's your own cloud. It is definitely possible. I would not recommend it, but it's something that you could do. The next step up is really that you go to a cloud provider, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and you rent virtual machines. And that now means that you take responsibility for everything that lives from the hypervisor and up, the operating system, all that sort of stuff, which also needs patching and upkeep. It can be a lot of work. And then we have a step up again, which is what we call platform as a service. That's where we run the whole platform for you. We run the operating system, and you just bring your code and your data to this platform. And then, of course, the far extreme end of it, it would be software as a service, so things like webmail and that sort of thing. But if we think about where these two different versions of the FHIR server fit, the open source server, the FHIR server for Azure, runs on top of platform components we manage, but you now take responsibility for the code. It falls into the layer that you manage. Whereas if you run the managed service, then all of that falls below the line and we take care of it for you. But you also have less things that you can play with. Another thing to consider is where you want to run this. So the managed service is right now available in 10 regions, and that's growing. We'll be in more than 20 regions here in the next couple of months. But that may not cover the region that you're in. So one consideration for running the open source server would also be if it's not available in the region that you want it in. You can deploy the open source code in all of our data centers. So I think that's enough said around what it is that we're making, what products it is that we're making. Now I want to focus on, for the rest of this presentation, what you can do with it. And I want to start very simple. We're basically going to, together here, we're going to build the Hello World application for FHIR. And in this sort of scenario, there's really three components to it, and we'll walk through how to set this up. But there's a FHIR service, right, a FHIR API, and then there's an identity provider that's involved in securing access to this FHIR API, and then there's a client application that accesses the FHIR API. We're going to build all of these things together from scratch in the Microsoft Azure cloud. So what we're going to do is we're going to take all these sort of generic components and then we're going to replace them with things that we have in the cloud. So instead of the generic FHIR API, we're going to run the Azure API for FHIR, and I'll show you how to set that up. We're going to have an identity provider, and in Azure, we call that Azure Active Directory. It's really just an OAuth provider. And then we have a web application where we're going to be hosting a very simple web app that we're going to be building together. All the code and examples and steps to provision this is available in this little repository down here, and that's also where that shortened URL that I had earlier leads to. And there's actually a bunch of cards here with those URLs on as well. There's a stack of them down here, so if you miss the URL, you can come and grab one of those later on. So once we're done with this little very simple app, we're going to make it a little bit more advanced. We have another sandbox that you can deploy, which in addition to provisioning the FHIR API, will also give you a little dashboard where you can browse patients. There's smart on FHIR applications. There's an Azure function that you can use to load Cynthia data into this FHIR server so that you have something to look at. We have a data factory process that we can use to pull data out of the FHIR server, put that into blob storage where we can access it with Databricks and other things like that. So that sandbox, we have some scripts and automation for you to provision very quickly. That's also something that you can come and do with us while we're here, or you can do it at home. It's all captured in the slides. But I'll walk through what you can do with that sandbox. That's a great place to start if you're getting into developing FHIR applications and you want something up and running and something to play with, and then you can take it apart later on and modify it. So what I'm going to do now, if the internet cooperates, is I'm going to break out of the slides here, and I'm actually not going to show any more slides, hopefully. And then I'm just going to do walk through these steps that we're going to be doing together here. If it all fails, I have slides for everything, so we should be okay. But my plan is to just kind of walk you through it here. So the first thing, if we thought about this like Hello World application, there was three things that we needed, right? We need a FHIR API, we need an identity provider, and then we need a client application. And we're now just going to march through how to deploy these. So what I'm looking at here, and I hope that's visible behind me and it's on the screens there as well, is the Azure portal. If for those of you that are new to the Microsoft Azure Cloud, that's just a web interface where you can go in and provision various stuff, virtual machines, databases, and so on. What you can also provision in here is a FHIR API, and so I can just go in here and say I want to do something with FHIR, and there's the Azure API for FHIR, and I can create one instance of these here. So this is, as I said, a general availability service now. So we offer this with an SLA, and we take care of it for you if you provision it like this. I'm going to create a resource group for this. I think I'm up to 18. I've given a few of these DevDays presentations. This is my fourth DevDays, by the way, which means I've been to half of them, I guess. So I'm like a veteran now. So I've given this, I give it an account name. You have to pick somewhere to provision this. We're in Western Europe, so that's what I'm going to do. You pick Stu3 or R4. There's a number of other settings here related to identity management and so on. The default is that it deploys with the Azure, configured with the Azure Active Directory that's associated with your subscription, and that you as a user will have access to this FHIR API. So I'm just going to hit create here. And what's going to happen now is that we go and provision this FHIR API for you. So there's a database that gets provisioned on the back end, front end, web services, and all that. You will see none of those things at the end of it. We run it all for you. And in sort of TV show or cooking show style, I've done it in advance so that we don't have to wait for it. It takes about 5 minutes to provision, but I've also provisioned an instance of this ahead of time, along with a few other things that we will need. And again, I've captured in the slides how to do this, so don't worry about it. But I wanted to save some time here. So what you can see I've provisioned in here is the FHIR API itself. There's also what we call a log analytics workspace, and that's actually where I'm dumping all the audit logs and things like that for this managed service that come into it. It's one of the features that you get with something like this. It's instrumented, and you can go and search the audit logs and things like that. These are, of course, things that you can set up yourself, but it's a little bit easier when we do it for you. There's a web application here which we will put this little JavaScript client that we're going to be making into. There's something called an app service plan, which is, you can think of that as the hardware that underpins the web application. And App Insights collects logs for the web application. I've made a few modifications to the FHIR API itself here as well. And I just wanted to point them out. It's captured in the slides as well. But I've enabled cores here because we will be making a JavaScript, little single-page JavaScript app. And then I mentioned this thing with log analytics. That's something that you can enable here in diagnostic settings. I'm saying that I'm putting all my logs into log analytics, and we can go take a look at those a little bit later on in this presentation. But we have a FHIR API, so the first thing that we should do is we should check that that actually works. So hopefully it does. So I'm going to go into Postman here, and I'm just going to take the capability statement for this FHIR service. And there should be nothing special about this. We're running FHIR R4, and it's a standard FHIR server. There's nothing, nothing particular here. But what I'm going to do then is try to access, for instance, the patient endpoint here. And what we will get here is a 401, right? Because I don't have a valid token, I can't just access this FHIR API. And this may be what's a little bit different from if you go check out some of the other sandboxes. There are a lot of like unsecured FHIR APIs that you can go and access, and that's great for playing around and doing a few little things, but most of the time you'll need to figure out how to set this up properly and get a token. And ours is configured with OAuth on all the time. So we need to figure out how to get a token for this. So if you think about the three things that we had to do, get a FHIR API, configure the identity management, and then doing the client application, we're now on to number 2, which is our identity management platform here. So I'm going to go back to the homepage here of the portal and go into Azure Active Directory. And Azure Active Directory is an identity platform within Microsoft. It secures access to a bunch of different things, Azure being one of them. It has a lot of complex features for managing users and groups and access to devices and all these other things, and we'll use just a tiny little corner of this for the purpose here. But you will, if you have Azure, you'll have an Azure Active Directory tenant, and you can also spin up as many of these as you want for free. You can have additional Azure Active Directory tenants for having dummy identities and playing around with sandbox environments and so on, and I encourage you to do that. So what we need to do is create a client application registration. And so I'll click my app registrations here, and the way that I would do this is that I would click new registration here and then walk through that process. It's captured in the slides, but I've also done it ahead of time, just so that we could save a little time here. I wanted to point out a couple of things that you want to set up. This is not unique to our application or to our platform, but when you set up client application registrations, you have to configure reply URLs for these client applications, and those are the URLs that are allowed to receive authorization codes when you go through the OAuth flow. I've set up a few here. You can see I've set up, these are public clients because I'm going to be making a JavaScript app. I've set up localhost because I'm going to try and run my JavaScript app locally. I have the web application that we'll deploy into, and I've also set up Postman here just so that I'll be able to get a token in Postman. And then I have set up some API permissions here, and I have given this particular application access to Azure Healthcare APIs, which is what you need for our FHIR service. Again, the details are captured in the slides. So if I now go and I take this client application ID, I can use this in Postman, and I've cheated a little bit. I think I've already set all of this up, and I'm going to paste this in here just to make sure. And I've configured here the authorization endpoint, the token endpoint, and if I say request a token now, I'm actually already logged in. So it should get through this and give me an access token here, which I can then say use token. And now if I try to hit send here, I should get a 200 OK, which I do. So we now have a valid token and we have access to the FHIR service, right? So that's a very important like debugging step here before you start setting up a bunch of stuff. Make sure that you can access your FHIR server. The other thing that we notice is that the FHIR server is actually empty. There's nothing in it, right? So that's not very exciting. So we will stick a patient in there, and I think I've queued one up already. So I'm just going to do post here and go to the body. And what I've taken here is just the first example application in the FHIR spec that I'm sure many of you will have played with before. So if I hit send on this here now, I should get a 201 created. So I've now put a patient into the FHIR server. And if I go back and try to retrieve all of these here, I should see now that I have I have one patient in my FHIR server, right? So in the 3 items that we're going to be doing here, set up a FHIR API, sort out the identity provider, we're now ready to get on to step 3, right? We're able to get a token, we have our identity stuff sorted out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to move on to building the client application. And we've also cheated a little bit here, but you can do you have the same opportunity to cheat. So in this GitHub repo here, we have also made a small application, and it's just a single page JavaScript app, and it's about as simple as it gets. There's a little bit of HTML here, there's a greeting, and then there is a patient table here where we're going to be making a list of patients, and then there's some JavaScript. And this can look a little bit daunting, but it is actually sort of fairly boilerplate and about the minimum amount of stuff that you will need to complete the OAuth flow. So when you're authenticating, what will happen is you go to the authorized endpoint of your identity provider, you get signed in, a token or a code is returned to the client, this code is then exchanged for a token and so on. That song and dance back and forth has to be orchestrated somehow, and that's what this JavaScript code does. It can be done in slightly different ways, but this is about the bare minimum that you will need to get going. But what you can simply do when you play with this is you can just clone this repo or find another simple example of a JavaScript app and use that. You will need to make a couple of adjustments to the code. And so I have already made them ahead of time, but there's 3 adjustments you need to make. One is you need to put the client ID for the application into the code here. The next thing is that you need to put the authority, so the specific instance of Azure Active Directory that you're using in here. And the third thing that you need to put in is the URL for your FHIR server. But then this client should work. It should bring up a greeting. When you log in, it should retrieve a list of patients. In our case, we just have a single patient, so it's not going to be super dramatic, just to set your expectations, but it should work. What we've also done is I put in a little package.json file that just has the HTTP server in there, so you can run this locally. So I'm going to do here, I'm just going to do npm start, and that should get a web server up and running. And I just want to make sure, before I put this, before I upload this into my web application, that I can actually run it locally. So I'm locally running on this machine here right now. And I'm going to hit sign in, and I'm already signed in because I'm signed into the portal, right? So it should recognize that I'm signed in, which it does. and then it goes and gets a token for the FHIR server, and then it prints now this one patient that we've added into the FHIR server. So we've actually now created a JavaScript application that gets a token, accesses the FHIR server, and lists the patients. And of course, then you can work on that to make it more elaborate. And really the last piece now in this Hello World example is that we take this application and then we deploy it into the cloud, right? We put it into the web application. There are many ways to load code into web applications. And what I'm going to do here is something very simple. I'm just going to edit it in the browser. It's probably not what you would want to do when you work on this in production, but just for the purposes of getting going here, this is an easy way to do it. So I've gone into this web application that we have, and before I start editing anything, I'm just going to grab the URL for it and stick that in here to the browser. And what you'll see is just some greeting screen, you know, hey, app service developers, you need to put in some code, right? So there's nothing in this, but we're going to now deploy the application that we just made. And what I'm going to do here is there's an app service editor. There's actually a few different tools for editing this, but this one is easy to show in the browser. You just click in here, and this is just a simple tool. It is nice for debugging, testing out little things. Again, it's not really a tool you probably want to write websites in production, but we're going to put in here index.html, and I'm going to just copy the code straight from this editor that I had into the browser. There you go, and it's already saved. So that's sort of the quick and dirty hack for deploying the code, but you can see that it's the same code that I had before. And now, if I refresh this, it looks the same, right? It's asking me to sign in, and I can hit the sign in button. Again, I am already signed in. It knows who I am. It goes to the FHIR server, hopefully, and then lists the patients that are available, right? Which in this case is just one. So we've actually taken it all the way through now here in about 10 minutes, right? We've managed to set up a FHIR server. I did skip ahead a few times. We've configured the identity provider. I have taken the code and I've deployed it into the cloud. The really cool thing here is that of all this sort of stuff that we set up here, the only thing that I am really responsible for, that I own here, is this little bit of JavaScript code. All the other stuff is being run by somebody else. It's being managed for you, right? The FHIR service, the identity platform, the app service environment, and all that. There's somebody else who's carrying a pager if that goes down. What you're responsible for is that little JavaScript application, which is rock solid, right? That will never break in this particular case. So that's the advantage of doing these sorts of things in the cloud. Okay, so now we're done with the simple application. So I mentioned that we have a slightly more elaborate environment, and I'll show you how to deploy that. We're not going to actually deploy it here, but I'll show you how to do it, and then I'll give you a little tour of what's available there and what you can play with. So again, going back to the GitHub site that we set up, here are all the instructions, by the way, for what I just did, the little JavaScript application. There's also the prerequisites that you need in order to do this tutorial. And if you don't have an Azure subscription, we have a link here for how to set yourself up with a free one. Cynthia is what we use for generating patients that I'll do in a second. If you don't have that installed, there's some pre-generated data and so on, some other hints on what you need. But all of that is written up in here. Now, if we scroll down a little bit, we get to the larger sandbox environment. And this is the diagram that I showed before. But this actually points to a different repo on GitHub. And this little samples repo is one that we maintain on the team. You can see I have the last commit here, right? So this is something that we write and maintain and keep up to date as our service evolves. So if you need a place to go and quickly pick up a sandbox to get something up and running and play with, you can always go there. And if it doesn't work, let us know, and we'll try to get it fixed. There are a few different ways that you can deploy this environment. There is the top illustration that we just had here with the Azure API for FHIR, dashboard, Smart on FHIR applications, but you can also in here deploy this with the open source edition of the server instead. So then you would have an app service, and there would be a backend database, which could be Cosmos DB or SQL, if you want to go rummage around in the database and see how all of that is put together. So number of different configuration options between open source and managed service and SQL and Cosmos DB and Stu3 and R4 and all these different configuration options that you have. So to manage that and make it automated to deploy, we have a few scripts that you can run, or it's actually a single script that calls a few scripts. These scripts are written in PowerShell, and for those of you that don't have PowerShell, don't worry about it, because there is a PowerShell in the Azure portal. If you go here, there's this little Cloud Shell icon, and this will bring up a shell that it's either a bash shell or it's a PowerShell, depending on, you can switch back and forth. And so if you don't have PowerShell installed, or you're on a machine where you can't install PowerShell, you can run the Cloud Shell and run it, the deployment in there. If you do this from your own laptop, you will need two PowerShell modules. One is the AZ module, which is how that we use to provision resources in Azure and so on. And then there's the Azure AD module, which is what we use to communicate with Azure Active Directory. And what this particular deployment script does is, in addition to provision the resources in the environment, we also set up the identity stuff for you. Client application registrations, test users, all this other stuff, so that you have a working sandbox. And that's why we need this module. So the way that you do this is you clone this repo. That's the easy part. Then you log in here to your Azure account. And then you also log in again, and this could be slightly counterintuitive, but you log in again to Azure Active Directory. But now imagine that you have one Azure Active Directory instance that you use to control access to your subscription, but you want to use a dummy tenant, as I just mentioned before, to just have test users and things like that. You don't want to pollute your original environment. That you can sign into a different one. So now you're effectively signed in two different places, and then you go and run the deployment. So this kind of deployment script here supports that scenario. But you run the create script here, and then the only thing you really need is an environment name, but there are then a number of other configuration options that I mentioned before, between running the PaaS service versus the open source, SQL, Cosmos DB, and all these other things. So there are command line switches for all of that. You run that, and by the end of it, you've then provisioned this environment. I've cheated a little bit and done this ahead of time. Here's the Cloud Shell, by the way. We're going to skip out of that to have a little bit more screen real estate. But I have an environment here that I have already provisioned. And so there now, you'll see a number of resources in here, more than we had before, right? There is the actual FHIR API, which you should recognize from before. And then there are things like a dashboard, smart on FHIR applications. Here's the Azure function that you can use to load data and all of that stuff. I will sort of dive into a few of these different resources here in the remaining time, and show you what you can do with these various different things. But the way that I'm going to start this is, I'm going to start it by logging into this little dashboard that the environment comes with. And I have to remember what I called this. So what I did was I grabbed an incognito or in private browser window, because I wanted to log in with the test user that I created for the environment. And you can see this is now a different tenant from what I would normally use. So see if I can get that right, and if I can remember my password. There's actually a trick here. This will provision test users with passwords and so on for you. And if you can't remember those afterwards, when you go and try and do play with this environment, there's actually in here, as part of what gets provisioned, is what we call a key vault, which is the tool that we use to store secrets. And in there we keep the username, password, and client IDs, and client secrets, and all this, for all of the things that get provisioned in that environment. They get captured in there, so you store those in a safe place. So if you forget what the passwords are, they will be in there. Okay, so this is now not very exciting, right? We have this dashboard with nothing in it, right? So the first thing that you want to do to this environment is you want to load some data. And we have this Azure function here that we have permission. So Azure Functions, it's a serverless platform where you can just stick a little bit of code into it, and we will run all the underlying infrastructure for you. These are very useful for things that get triggered when stuff lands in a storage account or somebody hits a URL and you want to run a little bit of code. And so what I've done here is I've set up this Azure function to listen to a storage account. And when data Cynthia bundles land in the storage account, they will get ingested and put into the FHIR service. So what I'm going to try and do, and this is when I get really nervous about the Wi-Fi, is I'm going to try and upload some data here. And I have some R4 patients. And again, I mentioned that, let me just hit upload here. So I mentioned that these are Cynthia patients. I believe that there are presentations about Cynthia in this at this meeting. If not, go look it up. It's a really useful project that generates synthetic patients. And what the tool generates is a bundle, right? In each of these bundles is all the stuff that happened to this patient in their synthetic lives. They get born, they go to the doctor, they get weighed, measured, they have various health events in their lives, and all of that gets captured in there as FHIR resources, and you have those collected in one place. It's a very useful tool if you want to load thousands of patients and see how your system works and so on. But what happens now is that they land in this blob storage account. The Azure function discovers that they're there. It picks up these bundles, takes them apart and makes sure all the references match and all that, and then it starts putting these into the FHIR server in parallel. And this should not take too long, but it will depend a little bit on how you've scaled your FHIR server and so on. I'm very nervous now, if you can't tell. I'm going to go here and refresh this, and hopefully I have some patience now in my FHIR service. So, phew, that actually worked. So it'll take a little while. Actually, if I go back here in the portal and refresh this now, you can see they're actually already gone. That's a way that you can tell all this has been ingested. But of course, if you load thousands and thousands of patients, it will take some time until this loads in there. So what you can do in this dashboard here now is you can take a look at the FHIR resources, right? It's a good way to navigate around and see what FHIR actually looks like. And I can also find a patient here, for instance. Let me take a look at this, which is a slightly younger patient. And I can see what's going on with this patient. Here's some conditions, encounters, and again, look at the underlying FHIR resources. So it's just a little way to navigate around in your FHIR data. What we've also done in this environment is we've configured some Smart on FHIR applications. If you guys are new and you don't know what that is, there's several presentations about it here, but it's these are basically third-party applications that can access your FHIR API. And the sort of classical example of a Smart on FHIR application is the growth chart. And this is not an application that we have written, but what we do when we provision this environment is that we take the source code straight out of the Smart on FHIR GitHub repo, and we provision that into an app service, and we're now pointing it to our FHIR server and pulling out the weight and height measurements for this particular patient and displaying the growth chart. If you're new to Smart on FHIR and you want to figure out how that platform works, we've also put the medications application in here, which is much simpler and not very visually appealing to look at, but it's very little code. And so it's a nice place to start where you can go in and see what's the flow actually and what goes back and forth. So these are kind of two different types of applications. You can add additional ones to the environment in there. And the other thing that's useful in this dashboard is it has this little About Me link. And in the About Me link, there's the URL to the actual FHIR server, and there's a token for this particular user that's signed in. That's of course not something you would want to have in a production application, but this is very nice for a sandbox environment. You can see what it looks like in the dashboard, and then you can go into Postman with your token and actually interact with your server and figure out what happens there. Okay, so that's just a little bit about that. So we covered the dashboard, the loader functions, the Smart on FHIR applications. And what we also have in here is a data factory. And Azure Data Factory is our sort of data movement platform. think of any time where you want to take data from, say, a database or some files or something, you want to read it in, you want to transform it a little bit and stick it into something else. This is an opportunity to use Azure Data Factory. And what we do here with this environment, by the way, there's a special, there's a command line switch for whether or not you want to deploy the Data Factory or not. But if you choose to do that, it will get provisioned with a few different pipelines configured already here for exporting encounters, medication requests, observations, patients, and practitioners. You can add more to this, but this was just to have something going in there. And what we do is, this actually works with any FHIR server, whether they support dollar export or not, because we just pull this data out through the FHIR API. And you can go in here and run these pipelines. I just started the patient one, and I'll run the observation one as well. It's actually sort of a two-stage process here. We suck all the data out, and then we do a little bit of transformation to it. But what we end up producing in the end is this new line delimited or ND-JSON format where there's one line for each resource in the file. So this is the bulk FHIR specification. And once you've run this, you will now have access to all this data in a storage account that's associated with this, this data factory. So I'm going to click in here and just show you what that looks like. And here we go. And I'm trying to keep an eye. I think I have like 4 minutes left or something, so we should be good. But you can see here this just ran 12:31, and here is the patient one, which is the smaller of the two files. And if I open this up, you'll see here that there's like one line for each of the patients that we imported. And if I opened up the observation one, which is a much bigger file, there would be one line for each observation and so on. And this is now a format that's pretty easy to read into other platforms if you wanted to explore this. One example is Databricks, which is like Spark. And we actually have a little example of an IPython notebook that I've put in here. So you can take that and take that in as an example. I have it loaded up here in Databricks, and I don't know if I'm connected to my cluster, so I'm not going to run anything here. But the way that you use this notebook is that you put in the storage account and you put in the secret for the account. This is not best practice, by the way. You'd want to put the secret in the secret store and all that, but for the purposes of making this easy, this is what we've done here. I then create a table for observations and a patient for tables. And in this case here, we're pulling out the latest height measurements, the latest weight measurements. And I wanted to dive in and grab some stuff from an extension on the patient here, latitude and longitude of the patient. And then we do a join across all of this stuff and end up producing a table here where you have last name, longitude, latitude, and weight and height values. So we're now joining data over multiple resources, and you can have a lot of data behind this, and how quickly that ends up running, it depends on how much compute you provision for this. So I have 2 minutes left, and what I'm going to do in those 2 minutes before I take questions is just go back to the slides here and put up so you can see here in this presentation, which is uploaded to the GitHub repo, there's 100 and some odd slides with screenshots for everything that I did here. And the way that you would find this is there's the shortened URL, which leads to this GitHub URL. Here is the sandbox environment, and this is how you get a free Azure account. That's my email address here. We have these cards with all the links on too. We have a little table somewhere out there where some of us will be hanging out, and you can come and grab one of us, grab me, ask questions, and try to deploy this either here or when you get home. So with that, say thank you for your attention and take any questions you might have. Any questions in the 1 minute remaining? Yeah. Yes, so the question is, what search parameters are supported? Yeah, I would like to say all of them, but it's not entirely true. We try to cover it all. So we basically just take the spec and we do our very best. And all the basic search parameters, that are defined in the base spec, we extract automatically and make those available to you. It's all listed in the capability statement, right? We list all the search parameters. What you can also do in the open source code, actually, we have the search parameters are defined in there in that search parameters file, right? And if you had additional things that you wanted to search, you can actually add them to that file, and then they will get indexed as well. Yeah. Yes, not supported right now, but it is something that is on our immediate roadmap. Yeah.
What are your release cycles?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So the two answers to it, right? The open source stuff, there's code going into that all the time, right? And it's open there. You can see the process. It gets merged in on a regular basis. We have a pretty rigorous process around code review and so on that Brendan's going to talk through and explain how all that works. But then the model that we work on is that we do the development there in the open, in that open source, and then with some regularity, we then funnel those features into the managed service. But how quickly they make it in there varies, right? Some things are very easy. They don't require any additional infrastructure. It might just be a new parameter that you can supply in the API or something, and that will probably roll in within a couple of weeks, right? Typically, that's the shortest cycle from something hitting the open source to it getting into the managed service. Other things require actual infrastructure to be deployed, and so they take us longer to get that instrumented correctly. One example is dollar export. It's available in the open source. For us to do that well in the managed service, we need to provide capability that you can tie the FHIR service to a storage account so that that goes somewhere, and all this thing around managing identity and certificates and how all of that works just takes more engineering work. So that's an example of something that takes us a little bit longer. But I would say we aim to get things from the open source into the managed service within a quarter, and then 2 weeks is the shortest. Some things take a little bit longer. It just depends.
Given an existing database, which is not FHIR, for instance, would it be reasonable to start from this open source variant and try to map into the existing database, or is that something you would not recommend?
So you think about taking our stack and putting it on top of an existing data store?
Yeah.
Yeah. Using our stuff as a facade, it can be done. I wouldn't say it's like super easy, but one of the things that, I mean, the nature of it is you have some schema, right? And now you have, what you get from using that stack is that a search comes in, we parse that search string and give you an AST. We separate out supported search parameters from not supported search parameters and give you all the infrastructure. But at some point, you still need to figure out what does that search mean in my data layer, right? And that's some serious it could be serious hard work, or it could be easy. But actually, Brendan, maybe I shouldn't say what he will be doing, but I think one of the things that he will be showing is to do exactly that. You have some files somewhere, and I want to put a FHIR API on top of it. How can I do that? Things like the basic CRUD operations, reading a resource, pretty easy. Taking the search tree and turning it into what it means in your data layer could be a lot of work. And it may not be performant depending on what that data layer is. So, but yes, it's doable. Absolutely, yeah. Cool. All right. Thanks, everyone. And just come grab me. I'll hang around for a little bit here. And otherwise, you can also find me later out at our little booth out there.